Prudence, can you not squeak the squeaker while I'm filming? We're live on set. How's it going, my SAAB friends? My name is Gary, and this is my channel, Weakest of Weeks. If you're a first-time viewer, I appreciate you clicking on the video and definitely consider subscribing. I have a ton of how-to videos out there, and especially SAAB-related videos. Now, today's video, we're going to be doing what's called a secondary air injection system delete, or it's probably better known by its acronym SAI. And now, there's no performance benefits whatsoever to this system if we delete it. However, if it is in full working order, it's my understanding that it prolongs the life of the catalytic converter by preheating it on cold starts, and it also burns off excess emissions on these cold starts. Now, this car is a full bolt-on car, meaning that it has a catless downpipe and mid-pipe, so the catalytic converters are no longer there. So there's no cats to preheat on cold starts. Furthermore, the car has 138,000 miles, so it's realistically only one more system that can potentially fail in the near future based on the mileage and age. So there's a couple awesome companies out there that make this a very simple process. You can just straight up bolt these little block-off plates to the exhaust manifold or manifolds, depending on what year 2.8 liter V6 you have. Or, like this video, we're gonna go a full-on deletion. So we're gonna remove the pump and everything else affiliated to it and not just blocking off the exhaust manifold. So not only will that rid the system of any potential future faults, but it will also free up space by the starter where the pump is. That way, if we ever have any issues with the starter, we'll have that space available and we'll have less hassle. So I'll quit rambling and I'll go ahead and show you how we're gonna delete off this secondary air injection system on your SAAB. Now, throughout this process, we're going to be removing a bunch of components from the car, but realistically, we're going to be adding some as well. Now, the first one and most important is this block-off plate. This is the one that goes on the exhaust manifold. Now, what comes to mind is a few companies that make this, the first one being Genuine SAAB, and then this particular one that came from my friend Brennan Cutler at BC Innovate, which is going to be a much more elegant solution. So Brennan's here also comes with the hardware. Genuine SAABs, I don't believe it does. You have to reuse your rusty and crusty bolts, whereas Brennan's here is nice, flush fit, much more elegant solution. And then another benefit to Brennan's is that it also comes with the exhaust manifold gasket. Now, this stuff is pretty much, I think, comparable to Genuine SAABs as far as price point at this point in time. One major thing to consider is that the Genuine SAAB version actually comes with 2 block-off plates. So if you need 2 plates, it would be more cost-effective to go with the Genuine SAAB version. Either way, both brands are great quality and, in my opinion, very reasonably priced. Additionally, I picked this up from Boost Products. This is a 35mm silicone cap. Now, you don't have to do this, but I'm actually going to be adding this to the intake. Now, this is a DO88 charge pipe, but this will also work on the plastic factory intake. And along with that, I have a worm drive clamp. This is, I believe, 21 to 54 millimeter, and this one's kind of a little crusty. It's been kicking around my garage for a little bit, so I'll likely replace it with a brand new version, but as far as sizing, I think that should be perfect. And then also, I'm going to use a bit of Permatex anti-seize on these bolts just in case I ever want to remove them again. For starters, you'll remove the plastic upper engine cover, and what that does is it exposes this valve right here for the secondary air injection system. Now, it can be a little misleading. You can follow this tube down while this goes to the pump. So we're going to wait on that. Now, the more important part for this is this little like chrome silver looking tube. So follow that down, and then it bolts up to the front exhaust manifold with these 2 bolts. Now, depending on what year you have, it may have another tube going to the rear exhaust manifold, but on this 2008, we only have one. So I ended up spraying these 2 bolts with some penetrating blaster here. I soaked that overnight. I also ran the engine up to operating temperature, so these bolts should be nice and warm, and it'll be ideal for backing these out so we don't snap them. We're going to start with the method that most people will likely do as far as deletion. They're going to contain all of these components here, but eliminate it at the exhaust manifold. Now, you may end up cutting this, or you can take it all the way down to the pump and remove it and block it off. Whatever you may do, the first step is going to be to undo these 13mm bolts. Like I said, you'll want to soak these in some penetrating oil and we'll get a nice long extension in here. And that is going to be the first one. I'm going to try to break this thing loose. Definitely helps to have a magnetic tool. To get access to the next bolt, we're actually going to undo the connector for this mass airflow sensor. So it can definitely be tricky, but push in on this tab, set that to the side, and then you might be able to see the bolt right there. Now we have a 10mm bolt that holds this whole thing together here. So we'll get the ratchet on here. We're going to go ahead and remove this 10mm bolt along that heat shield. Here's the part you may not want to be fully invested in this project with. Now that we have this loosened up all the way down here, to get this valve out, we're going to have to take off this upper intake, or the plenum right here. There's one bolt right there that we can access. The other one, not so much, to remove this tube. So some people may take a tube cutter and snip this off and then just block it off, and then use the block off plate down there on the manifold. Or if you're like myself, we're just going to go ahead and continue on with the project and go ahead and remove this upper plenum to get access to this, to remove it completely. And then, unfortunately, we will need to get under the car to remove where all these hoses are going, because the pump and everything is down there. We've sort of fast forwarded through time and we skipped a couple important steps. And I understand if you're upset with me about it, but quite frankly, use the cards in the top right of the video or the links in the description, and I promise you, you'll see exactly how to remove this plenum, or better known as the upper intake. But now that that's removed, we have better access to this valve. There's two 10mm bolts underneath here. We have a 1/4 inch drive with a 10mm on the end. There's one bolt here, one farther down in there that we're not really going to be able to see, and this bracket is unfortunately going to stay, because if you remove this heat shield, I think you have to remove the turbo to even get access to the other side to remove this bracket. So the bracket will stay, this valve will go, as well as the hoses. And if you're wondering as far as this, well, peeking down in there, there's an intake and exhaust valve. So we definitely want to keep this valley all nice and clean as best as we can. So we have some shop towels in there, but we'll go ahead and remove those two 10mm bolts to release the valve. Well, I tried to gracefully remove that, keep everything intact. Well, unfortunately, that was not the case. This old brittle plastic sheared right off. We have the block off plate, don't forget the gasket, and then the two bolts that go with it. Now, These, I guess they are a 4mm Allen. I don't know, you decide. This is where we're at. It says 4, and it locks it into place real nice. So I do have the same thing just about in a socket. Now this is a standard, so there's a little bit of slop in there, but I really want to go ahead and use this Allen first. Now before we install it, I'm going to use a little bit of Permatex anti-seize just so we make sure that if we ever want to remove this, we'll be able to. Awesome. This is the part I tell you about real street. So I ended up dropping both bolts, the gasket, and the block-off plate down there. So far I've managed to retrieve 1 bolt, the gasket, and the block-off plate, but I have yet to retrieve 1 bolt. I had to freaking mangle this exhaust shield just to get some access to it. So word to the wise, be ever so cautious whenever you're installing that little block-off plate. It's quite deceiving. Wish I was able to really get you a video of getting this little block-off plate in place. Quite honestly, this little guy is an absolute demon. Unfortunately, I dropped everything down in here and I had to mangle this little exhaust heat shield just to recover everything down in here, but fortunately I was able to recover it. But if I had any advice whatsoever, whenever you install this, make sure you just go ahead and do 1 bolt, the block-off plate, and then the gasket in behind here first. Start one first, thread it in by hand, and then start it like with something like this. So this is obviously a pretty crude thing going on here. And then once you have 1 bolt in place, swing the other one up, and then go ahead and start it by hand. So that's the method I did. Not pretty by any means, but you know what? The plate is on there. Continuing on with the secondary air injection system deletion, the valve that used to reside right here is removed. We do still have some tubing to remove. Now this is totally optional. This I am choosing to remove and put a cap on here. Now you can use like a little pod filter if you really wanted to, but I'm kind of going more like OEM look in the engine bay. And then I do have in there that block off plate. And if you're wondering as far as the heat shield, unfortunately I did have to mangle it because I originally dropped that block off plate down in the depths of that. So I was not able to utilize the original hole. Just no matter what I did, I was never able to get it lined back up. So I just drilled a new hole, no big deal. You really don't know that I had to modify that just to get it back into place, but we'll move on. We'll go ahead and remove all this remaining tubing. A lot of this stuff we'll have to do from underneath, but at least up top, we'll go ahead and disconnect this one right here. While we're up here, we'll go ahead and put on my little block off. So that just pops on like such. Now you can use a little pod filter if you really wanted to, but I want to go for more of like an OEM look. So that's the reasoning behind just doing a cap like this, and then we just have that little hose clamp we'll put on here and tighten that down. So this clamp is just temporary. I'm likely going to order a black version of this. Underneath the car, it's pretty easy to identify the secondary air injection pump. For reference, you have the oil filter housing here. There's a big bracket that mounts the pump, and then of course the affiliated hoses and tubes. So we have a T40 Torx we're going to remove here. Another T40 Torx bolt right up top there. With the 2 bolts out of that bracket, you can really now manipulate this to where you need it to go. So what we're gonna do is on the back side here, it's going to be rather difficult to see, but there's actually a hose clamp right here. We'll undo that, and then there is an electrical connector right here we need to disconnect. But for starters, We'll release that. Also up top, we need to disconnect the connector right here. There's what appears to be two bolts on it, possibly two Torx bolts. We're not going to worry about those. We just need to disconnect the actual connector going into that sensor. Check out all this room we now freed up. Bunch of room in here. By bunch, I mean enough to at least get my hand down in here, which wasn't the case before. And crawling underneath, the main reason why I did this deletion is now we have access to the starter that we didn't previously have. And I'm working on a solution for this. I'm gonna plug this off. I think I'm gonna depin the original connector, put it in here and squeeze some silicone in here, and of course that'll be zip tied. This will be zip tied. And it always pays to do some diligence. Just kind of poke around, be nosy. I mean, it's your vehicle, right? So just kind of look for anything out of the ordinary. One thing I wanted to mention is there's a very common ground fault here. If you have some starting issues and some other weird stuff, you can see how this one's a little bit rusty. Well, that's pretty common spot to rust, and that is a main ground point, so definitely want to make sure that's clean. And also while I was peeking at the starter, I noticed something quite odd. So yes, it is rusty, but being in Central Ohio, that's pretty normal. You see anything about a bolt there? So yeah, so there is a bolt not screwed in all the way. This one is, this one's not. I did get my hand on here, and it is pretty stock, so I am gonna take the E14, get it on there in my wrench to see if I can tighten that. But I mean, this is where it pays to do some diligence with a used vehicle. So I mean, it's kind of crazy. I've had this thing for over 3 years now, so I'm gonna try to remedy that. But like I said, it pays to kind of poke around while you're working on it to find any weird stuff like that. Here's the entire secondary air injection system on this 08. Quite amazing. They packed all of this nonsense in not a lot of space. So this is the one that's in right by the intake. To properly remove it, you have to remove that upper intake plenum. It goes down this very brittle plastic or nylon tube. Now this electrical connector, this straight up sheared off the tubing. This is the connector that goes onto the intake that I plugged off. Then of course this is the metal line that this valve sits on, and then this is where we installed that 2-bolt block-off plate. But this whole system, I'm very glad, is gone. It could potentially cause some issues in the future, like a P0411 code, I believe. And it's not really having a purpose with the catalytic converters removed. So best to just remove all of this nonsense. And now, fortunately, we freed up plenty of space in case we have any future starter issues. A good step to go above and beyond is to cap off the exposed pigtail. So in this case, I'm utilizing what we currently have. This is the SAI pump. I have this cheap set of depinning tools. I'll link it in the description. It works wonders for pins like this. So you just shove it in the end, and then after some finesse and tugging on the wires, the electrical plastic pigtail pops right out, and we'll be able to shove some silicone in there and use that to plug off the pigtail so you don't have any moisture shorting anything out. So here I just have some basic silicone I got at my local hardware store, and I'm just squeezing it in both sides. Now this is not the side that plugs into the vehicle, it's the opposite side. So again, that's where the pins going to the pump go to. Then I'm just squeezing the silicone in there and just blocking that off so no moisture will ever get in there. Once you're good and confident that no moisture will ever get inside of this plastic connector, you're pretty much done. You don't need to do anything to the side that plugs into the car. but what you do need to do is let the silicone cure. So set this one to the side, let that dry up. In the meantime, we're going to go ahead and take this original sensor. I'm not sure what exactly this sensor is. Obviously, it has to deal with the secondary air injection system, but it broke off, so I have no use for it. So what I'm using is a basic Dremel or a rotary tool to pretty much just simply hack this thing up. So I only need the tip of it, this plastic portion of it. Now, unfortunately, because of how the rotary tool works, at least the cutoff portion of it, and it's melting through the plastic, so it creates some slag. So I just kind of scrape some of that excess plastic off. It comes off pretty easily, and then once we have that good and cleaned up, the inside of it, we have to pull out the 3 metal pins. Unfortunately, you can't use that fancy little cheap depinning tool because this is a sensor, so we have to yank those out. There is 3 pins, but just grab some needle nose pliers, wiggle it around, and yank those things out. Now, I did kind of go a little extra on this. The backside, it should actually be quite moisture resistant, but because there is some remnants of the original sensor portion to it, I decided to squeeze some silicone on it because I have plenty left, and then just smooth it out just to be 100% certain that no moisture will ever get into this connector. So we also have to set this one to the side to cure, and then once those are dried up, we're good to plug them into the car. These are the 2 plugs ready to go with some silicone, and it's nice and dry, and I'm going to utilize some dielectric grease just to be ever cautious, but doing this will ensure that those pins don't get corroded. Now, voltage shouldn't be going to them once we deactivate the SAI system, but it's always best to just cap any open pigtails so moisture doesn't get in there and affect other circuits. So we're good to reattach these, and then if you're wondering about the bolt that I was concerned about, it's officially tightened. So that is a wrap. I ended up putting the original SAI bracket bolt back into the case here. It looked a little out of place without it. I may put the other one up there back in it as well. But here you go. Now we have all this room freed up. If we ever have to replace a starter, literally we just move this hose out of the way, and there you go. You have access to these starter bolts right there. And then the wires are right there, more accessible from the other side. But I mean, look at that. Now we have all this room that we didn't have before. So that's going to wrap it up down here. Up top is just as free. So I'm very excited about that. Plenty of space in some different crevices that all that stuff took up. And if you notice, I have the clamp removed off here. I'm actually going to run to the parts store real quick, and I'm going to match up a new one. The other one is just kind of crusty and old. I've had kicking around the shop for a little bit. Now, the most important part of this process is getting rid of that pesky check engine light. There is no way around it. If you unplug the secondary air injection system, it will automatically kick a check engine light. The system, the car, does a quick diagnosis at the beginning of the key cycle, and if those components are not there, it's going to trigger a check engine light. So I have my basic scanner here. We'll go ahead and read the codes. There are a few in relation to secondary air. This one is a P2432. So no matter what we do, because those components are no longer on the car, it's automatically going to kick this check engine light. So the most important part of this process is to work with a tuner. Now, I am actually tuning the car regardless, there's a bunch of bolt-ons that I added to the car, so a tune is very worthwhile in my case, but also along with the process of getting the tune on here, I talked with the tuner, in this case Brian at Vermont Tuning, and I'm having him disable the secondary air injection system altogether so that we no longer have a check engine light. So let me show you real quick the process involved with that. Now, each tuner may be different. I did talk with Brian at Vermont Tuning. We did a few data logs. Now, I will have a separate video specifically on the tune for this car, but just know that I did do some data logging, sent the information over to Brian at Vermont. He did his wizardry and sent the stuff back to me with the SAI delete. So we'll go ahead and go into here. I'm going to go to the tune tool, select OK. We need to go to program calibration. Now at the bottom, select tune. And here you can see some of the base tunes that he sent me and some of the ones after we've data logged. So we'll go ahead and select this latest version. We'll go ahead and accept the terms to it. The key is in the ignition and turn to the on position. Successfully completed. Then we need to turn the ignition off. Whoops. And we'll have a countdown. All right, that is it. We're good to unplug it. Set the tuner to the side. Now I'm going to remove the key completely, and we'll go ahead and start the car. Go, the check engine light is no longer on the dash. Stuff is now removed. If this video helped you out, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Definitely consider subscribing. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, drop a comment down below. That being said, I appreciate you watching, and I catch you friends next time.